Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DMARC Tour. My name is Shehzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations for the New York City office. In this webinar, we'll talk about, obviously, DMARC, and we'll talk about the different parts of DMARC. So in terms of the authentication capabilities, the reporting capabilities, and what the conformance capabilities are, and how each of those parts work. We won't get too technical and too much of a deep dive in it because it'll probably take a little more than an hour to go through everything that we plan to go through in this webinar. But if at any point in time you do have a question, please do not hesitate to post those questions during the webinar. We'll do our best to answer those questions if we're able to throughout the webinar. If we can't get to it, we'll do our best to answer it after a webinar, or at least we'll send you a response back via email in response to your questions. So before we get into DMARC, first thing we do need to talk about is phishing. And phishing is one of the systemic global risks that GCA decided to go and try to tackle. I mean, obviously our goal is to hope is to eradicate phishing once and for all, but I mean, that's going to be a very difficult task to do. But we do and look at solutions that could help mitigate those and reduce the chance of receiving a phishing type email. And the reason we wanted to do this is because it does impact everyone and anyone around the globe. There is really no one that's safe from a phishing type email. At some point in time, it's going to get through, and it's going to someone or that one user will end up clicking on an attachment or opening an attachment or clicking on a link that they shouldn't be clicking on. And the major problem with phishing is not just receiving the email, but what could happen after you receive that email. So if they open up an attachment or even click on a link, it could lead to a malware infection. So it could be like ransomware or a keylogger or anything that just kind of sits back and sits silently until they're ready to take advantage of it. Or it could just lead to stealing of information. So it could be dealing with fraud. So they're getting banking information or false wire transfer type requests, or even theft of PII. So getting banking information, maybe social security numbers or other information that can help steal information about tax and things like that. And phishing is so successful because it is still difficult to determine if that particular message came from a legitimate source. Because yes, I mean, attackers are getting better in terms of their spelling, trying to use their grammar checkers and spell checkers and make sure everything is actually written out and well written. And the other part of it is also because when you look at where the message is actually coming from, and because it appears as though it is coming from a legitimate source. And in some cases, it's not just who it's coming from, but they can also look at the email address that attached to that person's name, and it appears to be coming from a legitimate source. So it's coming from a valid organization. So in this with DMARC, this is what's going to help you protect people from using that valid domain name. Because this is DMARC is a proven way to help mitigate phishing by preventing people or unauthorized users from using your actual domain name. So you're now performing and using capabilities for an identity check for your organization's name. Because it says DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. And those are the three components, authentication, reporting, and conformance, that we're going to be talking about throughout this webinar. So at first, I'm going into more detail into what is DMARC. So there's two parts actually when it comes to DMARC. There's a policy and there's a verification, both of which need to be implemented within an organization, right? The policy is going to define what is outgoing using your domain name. So it's a policy that's going to say that these messages that are authorized and authenticated by our checks are protected, and what to do with those messages if they're coming from a valid source or if they're coming from an invalid source. And then that's where the recipient side will now know what to do if the sender's authentication mechanisms were to fail. Where does that message go? Should it put it into the quarantine or junk folder or the spam folder, or should it completely drop the message? But in order for the receiving side to do that and be able to check for the DMARC policy, there has to be a DMARC verification component enabled. And that's typically going to be on your SMTP gateways or your spam and anti-spam and anti-phishing types tools will have the DMARC verification capability in there. It's built in. If not, you may want to go back to your vendor and say, we need this component. So that's the two parts. So we're going to mainly focus on the DMARC policy side because the DMARC verification side is, again, it's just going to be more of a check mark. You just go in and put in that check mark, and now it's going to check every incoming message for DMARC capabilities, and go back to the sending organization to check the policy. But the major benefit now is that by implementing DMARC, you're now going to be preventing unauthorized sources, which are hopefully just your spammers and phishers, from using your actual domain name. So now they can't send email on your behalf, and it'll prevent things like those malware infections, the email fraud, and the theft of PII. So that's one of the major benefits of it, because then now at this point, once you implement DMARC, now it'll increase your customers' confidence and trust, but also your partner's confidence and trust, and even your own employees' confidence and trust, because now at this point, they're going to get messages that are actually supposed to be coming to them rather than from an invalid source. It also then protects the integrity of your brand. So really, as you can see, I mean, there is a cybersecurity component of it, but it's mainly about brand protection, mainly about trust and confidence and maintaining your brand name, making sure that any marketing type campaign that you're going to do will actually get to the consumers, because the consumer side is not going to block it because they think it's spam, or it's thinking that it's part of some sort of phishing campaign. And that's what the additional benefit is because in terms of inbox protection, the consumer inboxes are already using DMARC email authentication. So they are doing verification for their consumers. So this is the gmail.com, hotmail.com, outlook.com, live.com, and so on. So all those consumer-based mailboxes, not business-based, but consumer ones. So where any citizen or any home user can just register for an account for free, and then send mail and do whatever they wish to do with those accounts. They're already protected. So that's about 4.8 billion inboxes worldwide. That's about 76% of the current total number worldwide. So that's a large amount. But in order for that to work correctly, the businesses, the government, the other entities that own these domain names need to apply a policy. So that way these consumer side and the DMARC verification knows what to do with those messages rather than just passing them through like normal. So that's really critical and really important, that part. The other part is the visibility that DMARC provides to you. This is one of the components that actually gives you the information of what's going on and what's being with the messages that are sent to those recipients. So you'll get reports back from the receiving side. So whether it be Google, whether it be a bank or a government entity, whoever is participating in DMARC and DMARC verification will send a report back to you. And that report will contain quite a lot of information. It's going to have all your authorized systems. So all the authorized systems are allowed to send on your behalf. And that's a great thing because in this way, in case there's something that's missing in your authentication checks or your authentication list, you need to add and make the adjustments. You can get that from these reports. But at the same time, these reports are going to also tell you all the unauthorized people. And those are hopefully just your spammers and phishers or spear phishers that are attempting to use your domain name or use your brand name to send messages. So this way you know what's going on both sides and you can make whatever adjustments and changes that you need, and then also move up to a higher level of DMARC where you can actually do enforcement and use the true value of DMARC capabilities. So those reports are very important and very critical to this entire process of implementation. Now, the other nice thing about DMARC is that it's actually free to use. And we're talking about, again, we're focusing on the policy side, not the verification side. The verification side, there's going to be costs associated with it because, again, if you don't have that SMTP gateway or any other type of tool that actually does the verification of incoming messages, you're gonna need to potentially purchase something in that side. But the policy itself is free to use because what you're doing is you're creating a record in your domain name server. That's all you're doing. It's one line that you're adding to the DNS to say that this is our policy. This is where the reports get sent to, and these are what you need. These are the checks and things that you need to handle. So that's where it's important. So you have to have access to DNS in order for this to work. So that's the basic overview of DMARC and the capabilities. Now we're going to go into a little bit more technical. So in terms of what are the components that are needed in order to go through the DMARC process. So again, as a reminder, if you do have any questions, please post those questions in that questions box that's available to you in your control panel. I'll take a look at the questions and answer any questions as we go along. So now in order to do proper implementation, yes, we talked about DNS and we'll talk about that a little bit later and what the actual record will look like and what are the different parts to the record. But in order for DMARC to be successful, you're going to need to have SPF, which is Sender Policy Framework, and DKIM, which is Domain Keys Identified Mail, in order to do full and get the full effectiveness of DMARC. So what are those two components? Now, these two components have existed longer than DMARC have. So a lot of people are quite familiar with SPF. Not too many are familiar with DKIM. But what SPF does is it's going to be another DNS record, and it's going to be a policy that's going to say that anyone who is on this listed in this policy, whether IP address, domain, or domain, are authorized to send mail using our domain name. So basically, if they're not on the list, they're not allowed to send mail using our domain name. So that's what SPF is going to do. And it's going to basically say that if it's not on the list, then the message should fail. Now, which is great. I mean, that's something that it should do, but it doesn't exactly work the way it's intended. And the reason for that is because on the receiving side, they have to have SPF verification enabled, but then on top of that, they need to determine what to do with that message when it fails. Because SPF just says the message fails if it's not on the list, but where should that message go to? Right, because the recipient has a spam folder. Should it be put in the spam folder, or should we just completely drop it completely, or should we review it and then release it as we need to? Those are too many things that the recipient side has to decide, and they may not always know what's going on with those messages. So the last thing they want to do is block a valid message from your organization because you just forgot to place in a third-party vendor, for example, that was just added. So those are things that they have to determine. The other thing with SPF is that if you're using a cloud service provider, so something like Office 365 or Google G Suites, their SPF policy or the policy that they tell you to implement is basically going to say that, well, use all Google mail servers or use all protection.outlook.com servers to send mail on your behalf, because it just makes it simpler for them. But that's the same SPF that other users of those cloud service providers will have as well. So there's nothing really preventing those domains from using other domains on that system. So there's nothing that's preventing that by using just SPF. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to discourage you from using SPF, because you need SPF in order for DMARC to work. But that's something. If you have SPF in place, that's great. That's one step further that you get and closer that you get to DMARC. Then DKIM, Domain Keys Identified Mail, is going to be another DNS record that's going to be used to add digital signatures to any outgoing messages or any system that's using your domain name that you have authorized to send mail on your behalf. So that's what DKIM. So it's just another layer of authentication that you're implementing with DKIM. So DKIM is kind of like, it is private key, public key, but depending on whom you use, either you'll have to manage your private key, public key pair with the public key being published in DNS, or if the third party provider, they may handle some of the keys for you and you just have to create the records that you need. Now, that's all DKIM does. It just adds that digital signature. It doesn't say what to do with the message if it fails or if it passes, really. It's all it's going to say is on the recipient side, if they have DMARC verification enabled, check to see if there's a signatures matches with the public key that's is on the sending side's DNS. Things match, okay, fine, that's great. If they don't match, then, well, you know what? It's up to you what you want to do with the message. So again, now the receiving side has to figure out what to do with that message. Do they put it into spam, or do they completely reject that message? It's on them to make that decision. But again, I'm not trying to discourage from using DKIM, because that's another component that's going to be and strengthen the capabilities of DMARC. Because what DKIM will do, and the benefit of DKIM is, especially if you use third-party providers, whether it's Office 365, Google G Suites, or a third-party vendor, you want to use DKIM because DKIM is the component that's going to protect and prevent others that are using the same systems from using your domain name. So you want to use DKIM along with SPF. Now, the other thing is that there's nothing that says, there's no part of the SPF policy that says check DKIM. There's nothing in DKIM that says to go check SPF. So you can use them individually, you can use them together, but there's nothing that's going to say to, combine the capabilities of those within SPF and within DKIM. So that's where now DMARC comes into play. DMARC is going to be the one that says, okay, the authentication checks you need to look for are SPF, and the other one is for DKIM, and check for both of those and make sure that they're set up correctly. And if everything's set up correctly, then follow the policy that's defined in the sending organization's DMARC policy. So then that's where it comes across. So now the receiving side, they just have to enable DMARC verification. They don't have to figure out what to do with the message. Depending on their systems, some systems actually give them the opportunity to make that decision, but it's not recommended to do that. Just follow what the policy is of the sending organization side, so that way things are run smoothly and things are run correctly and run appropriately. And then there's also no confusion what happens if messages were to get dropped. So that's SPF and DKIM. Not going to go too much more into detail with that unless there are any questions with it, but those are the two components that are needed in order for DMARC to fully function. You can get away with one or the other, but that's mainly if you're using internal systems and your own systems and systems you have control over. If you're using third-party systems, it is recommended to have both. So then what happens with a message once it's so what are the policy levels that you have for DMARC and that you can when you're sending out a message, and what policies will those organizations face when you send these messages out? So the way that will work is that you have 3 different options, and those options that are available to you are going to be none, quarantine, or reject. So those are the 3 policy levels that you can implement on DMARC. So what is the difference between the 3 aside from the name? So the first policy level is the lowest policy level, which is none. At none, what this means is you're basically putting DMARC into monitor only mode. And what monitor only mode means is that if the sending side has DMARC verification enabled, even if any of the authentication checks were to fail, let the message go through. Because we just need to make sure that everything is set up correctly, everything is working correctly, but don't do anything to the message. Let it go pass through and go to the recipient's inbox without any issues. So this way, then you as the sending organization can basically review the reports that are being generated by the recipient side and take a look at those reports and make whatever adjustments you need to make for SPF, DKIM, and making sure alignment is correct as well. So alignment in terms of domain alignment. So those are things that you can do by staying at none and keeping your messages safe and delivering through. So it is recommended to always start at none, but don't stay at none for too long if you can help it. Then the next level is quarantine. So quarantine basically means that if SPF and or DKIM or alignment were to fail, the message is going to go to the recipient's spam or junk folder. So it's kind of like a safety net. So in case something was missing and SPF and DKIM weren't set correctly, or if there was a fail in terms of domain alignment, then at least it goes to the recipient's quarantine folder rather than just to the inbox. But there's a problem with that as well, because you don't want to stay at quarantine for too long, because at some point in time, if the message is coming from an unauthorized source, it's also going to go to the spam or junk folder as well. And then at some point, the recipients can be like, oh, well, their stuff always tends to go to spam or junk, so this must be legitimate as well. They're not going to always know the difference. So that's why don't stay at quarantine for too long. Go to reject, because reject is where you're doing the full, strongest level of enforcement of DMARC. Because that's, again, at this point, if any of authentication checks were to fail, so SPF, DKIM, or alignment, the message is completely dropped and not even delivered to the recipient side. So they won't even get the message whatsoever. So that's why you want to get up to reject and not stay at quarantine or none for too long. So start off at none, check your reports, review the reports, and gradually move up. Now you can still get reports at quarantine and reject. That is still an option that's available to you. You just have to make sure you leave the appropriate tags in place. So overall, how is this actually working? So starting at the top left corner, right under overview where it says DMARC publish DMARC record, we'll start there. So obviously you need to publish your DMARC record and your SPF and DKIM records as well. If you don't have your SPF and DKIM records in place and you want to start off with DMARC, start off with implement the record at level none. and then you can make the SPF and DKIM adjustments and changes as you need to before you move up. But all of that is going to go on to your DNS server. So you as a sending organization, it's going to go on your DNS server, whether that be your own systems. Just make sure it's on a public system. That's a publicly accessible DNS. So, because I mean, that's where people need to be able to go and check to see what the policy is and your SPF list and your DKIM public key. So that could be your internal publicly available server, or it could be like a GoDaddy or Network Solutions and so on. So here at Global Cyber Alliance, we actually use Network Solutions for our name services. So our records are published there. Now, going to the next level, there's the sender's inbox. So the end user will just type up their messages like they would normally and hit send. They don't need anything special or anything unique to be installed on their system. So nothing for DKIM, nothing for SPF, nothing for DMARC. They just do what they need to do like they normally would. So they hit send, the message goes to the sending organization's email server, and that's where all the additional information is going to be added. So that way the recipient side knows to look for DMARC and look to go back and check for what the DMARC policy is. So the recipient's email server. So here again, so the policy, DMARC policy is applied on the sending side. The recipient side needs to have that DMARC verification capability, right? So before we even talk about the DMARC verification, if they do not have DMARC verification enabled or turned on, what happens to the message that has a DMARC policy applied to it? That message just goes through because there's nothing to check for DMARC. So it says, okay, you know what? This is a regular message. Just pass it on and put it into the recipient's inbox. Unless, of course, your spam filters or other filters on the recipient side do some other checks, and it could potentially go to quarantine. But at this point, we'll just assume that everything is fine. It passes on the valid email, or it passes on as if it's a valid email, no matter where it comes from. Okay. Now, if the recipient's email server has the DMARC verification enabled, so they have that check mark in place, it's now checking all incoming messages to see if there's a DMARC policy applied to it. So if there's a DMARC policy applied to it, that recipient email server is going to go back to the sending organization's DNS server to look at the policy. It says, okay, you have a policy in place, so we need to check SPF, we need to check DKIM, and make sure everything is aligned correctly, everything is passing correctly. So again, if your policy is at level none, if any of the authentication checks were to pass or fail, it passes on the message to the recipient's inbox. So even if the SPF were to fail, but DKIM was fine, it still passes it on, or vice versa. So it'll still pass on the email. Even if it's coming from an unauthorized source, it's going to pass on that message as a valid email, all right, when you're at level none. So messages aren't broken or messaging is not impacted at level none. Now, when you're at a higher level, quarantine or reject, that's where now enforcement is actually going to happen. So if the SPF or DMARC checks were to fail, then if you're at quarantine, the recipient will now know, okay, well, it's coming from an unauthorized source. Your policy is at quarantine. Okay, we need to put this into the recipient's spam folder or junk folder. If you're at reject, if authentication mechanisms are to fail, it completely drops the message and the message is not being delivered whatsoever. So there's a question about the reports, and I'll talk specifically what those types of reports that are being sent and what's going on there. So, and it is the last component there. So the recipient's email server is what is going to actually send the reports back. So as long as they have DMARC verification enabled, the reports will come back. If they do not have DMARC verification enabled, you will not get a report. Okay, so not all recipient email servers actually participate in sending reports. Some of them have control over whether they can send reports or not, so you may not get a report. It's hard to tell you exactly who is going to be sending it. I like to say that everyone who had DMARC verification enabled will send you a report back, but I've seen cases where I know people have DMARC verification, but they don't send a report back. I know that all the large ISPs like a lot of the larger banks, some government entities, all the consumer mailbox providers will actually send a report back to you. But and I'll just answer one of the. So I think I answered a few of those questions there. But and there's another question as a domain owner, can I ask Gmail or Hotmail to send me reports? You can try, but I'm pretty sure they will not send you reports because the reports are not meant for Gmail or Hotmail users. They're not meant for that because you have no control over it. You can't say where the reports go. Only Google has control over gmail.com. So Google can dictate where those reports go. And the aggregate reports are not detailed enough to tell you who the recipient is or who the sending organ, who specifically the recipient is. So they just know it's just going to gmail.com and that's about it. That's what an aggregate report, and we'll talk about more detail later on. So in DNS, we talked about the policy that is going to be created on your DNS system. So the way you create a DNS record is going to be a DNS TXT record or a text record. So when you create this text record is going to define that this is my policy level and this is where the reports are going to be sent to. So this is why the only way you can apply a DMARC record is to a domain that you actually own. So so if you're a Gmail or a Hotmail is your actual business mail, that's what you're using for business purposes, you're not going to get a report back. You only get a report back for a domain that you implement a policy for and that you actually own, so that you're authoritative for. And there's many cases and that'll happen. So there'll be a business domain that'll be used for web presence, but the people will use gmail.com for their email as an email capability. So you can apply the policy to the web domain if you choose to, even though it's not being used for email purposes, and just apply a highest level of reject to that. So you'll get reports back for that domain. You're not going to get reports back for gmail.com or hotmail.com. Meaning that if those are the domains that you're using. So the name of the record or the host is always going to be _DMARC. It must start with _DMARC. So for example, _DMARC.globalcyberalliance.org. That is the name of our GCA at the GCA. That's the name of our DNS TXT record. So you can look it up if this is because this is publicly available. Just go in NS lookup or use the MX toolbox, put in _DMARC or just put in Global Cyber Alliance if you're using a tool, and you can see our DMARC record. So the values for it, and this is obviously going to be the next important part. It must always start with V equals DMARC1, and then DMARC must be capitalized in order. So it's case sensitive with the DMARC part, and the rest is also case sensitive as well. So it should be lowercase, unless the email address is uppercase, lowercase, that's fine. But other values must be exactly as you see. So the version, that's what V equals, that's DMARC1. There's only version 1. There's no reports that version 2 or 3 or 4 is going to be released anytime soon. There's no discussion as well of using having another version of DMARC. The next tag is the P tag. The P tag is that's your policy. That's the policy that's going to be applied to your domain name and to your subdomains as well. So this is where you'll actually type in P equals none, P equals quarantine, or P equals reject. You can only have one for per domain. So it can't be _DMARC.globalcyberalliance with one value of being quarantined and then have another record of reject. It's going to create a conflict, and it's going to create DMARC is not going to function at that point. You can only have one DMARC record per domain. But you can have a subdomain policy as well, and that subdomain policy will override the top level policy. The RUA equals mail2 and the RUF equals mail2 are where you're going to send the reports to. So this way the recipient side says, okay, we know your policies at quarantine. Your RUA equals mail2 is somebody at your organization. This is whom we're going to send the messages, send these reports to. So it's going to be somebody within your organization. And by default, it has to be someone within your organization. If you want to send to someone outside of your organization, that's not, and so an external domain, you can do so, but there's extra steps that need to be done, because you can't just say that for _DMARC.globalcyberalliance.org, and we want to send mail to, I don't know, google.com, DMARC@google.com, it can't just be done. We'd have to go to Google and say, hey, we'd like to send you reports. Then they have to create another DNS entry on their side, on Google's side, in order to be able to accept the reports. So that way you're not just spamming anyone and everyone with your reports. So there is a control in place and control set up in that sense. So that's all you really need in order to create a DMARC record. There are additional tags. When you look at the complex one, there are additional tags. So there's like the FO tag, the ADKIM, ASPF, and so on. If you do not have these tags, it's always going to go to the default setting. So ADKIM and ASPF are always in relaxed mode. The PCT, which is by default, is always going to be 100%. And there's a question about specifying a policy percentage in DMARC record. What's the advantage of using less than 100%? Personally, I don't think there is an advantage, because if you use 50% or 10%, only 10% or only 50% of your messages will have the DMARC policy applied to them. But you cannot define which 50% or which half or which messages are the ones that will be impacted by DMARC. So you don't have that level of control with this. So, I think that it's better just leave it 100% and let it apply to everything. So there's no real advantage of using less than 100%. Now, there are two tags in the complex one that I do want to talk about and I do want to focus on and to bring people's attention to. And those are on the very last line, the RI equals and the SP equals. The RI tag is report interval. So by default, the report interval is always 86,400 seconds. So that's 24 hours. So that's going to tell the recipient side to send us a report every 24 hours. So send back a report to the sending organization every 24 hours. So it's going to be, and again, we'll talk about the types of reports, but typically it's the aggregate of, so it's going to be, send us an aggregate of all the messages that were sent to you within that 24-hour time frame. Give us that report back. It's not going to be individual reports of every single message. It's going to be the full aggregate review. You can increase and lower that number as you choose to. Again, if you do not have RI present, it'll default to the 24 hours or 86,400 seconds. The SP tag is the other one I want to talk about specifically, because as you see here, it says SP equals reject. So it looks like it's another policy that you're implementing. So if you explicitly define the SP tag, now you can actually define what the policy is for your subdomains. Otherwise, the subdomains will take on what the P tag is going to be. So if you have P equals quarantine, that means all your sub-level domains will also be applying the quarantine policy. So P equals none, everything is none, and same with reject. So an SP tag, you can also have SP equals none, SP equals quarantine, and SP equals reject. So what are examples of where you might use the SP tag? One would be in the case where you know for a fact that you do not have any sub-level domains. So that means like hr.globalcyberalliance.org or market.globalcyberalliance.org or sales.globalcyberalliance.org. Global Cyber Alliance is just globalcyberalliance.org. We do not have any subdomains whatsoever. So no public. So we're not talking about internal private ones. We're talking about public domains. So in our case, when we first started off, we would put in P equals none because we needed to look at the reports and make the adjustments that we needed to make. But then we had an SP tag of reject. So this way, while we're making sure that globalcyberalliance.org is being configured and set up correctly, it prevented any spammers or unauthorized sources from using those sub-level domains. So no one can send out mail using at hr.globalcyberalliance.org or at sales.globalcyberalliance.org. Those could no longer be used. But people could still use globalcyberalliance.org because we were at none. So this way, when we made our way up to P equals reject, now at that point, no one can use our domain name unless it's on the authorized list. So we could remove the SP tag because now the P tag would leave it as reject. I mean, if you leave P equals reject and SP equals reject, the tags are still both there. That's fine. It's not going to have an impact. The other side is going to be that if you decide that your top level domain, you have sub-level domains. So you actually have sub-level domains, and it could be they're dispersed, right? If you're a global organization, or if you're an organization that goes that's nationwide within your region, then and each of those locations have their own IT staff, and they're responsible for messages and maintaining that subdomain. This is where you can say, okay, well, we have a DMARC policy at the top level domain, and we're ready to go up to quarantine or reject. But our sub-level domains are not quite ready. They still need a little bit more time. So you can change P equals to quarantine or reject and put in SP equals none. So that way your sub-level domains can go through the process they need to do and create their own DMARC policies. So they have their own DMARC policies, and that DMARC policy, when they're ready, can go up to quarantine or reject. And that's the policy that will be applied to that domain at that point in time. And then eventually you can remove the SP equals none tag or change it to SP equals reject if you choose to. So those are the capable. That's why the SP tag is important to have, and make sure you use that appropriately and use it correctly. So here are some partners that use DMARC. You can see it's quite a range. I mean, this is a very small list. If I put all of our partners on here, you wouldn't be able to see their names, and they would just be too small. But I mean, as you can see, it's anywhere from IT services to software services to banks to health insurance, and so on. So it is a wide range, and basically anyone and everyone who owns a domain name should implement DMARC, whether you use it for email or not. I mean, if you use it for email, you definitely want to implement DMARC. But even if you don't use it for email, you still use DMARC to protect it and prevent other users from using it for email purposes. Now the reports. So again, I might be going a little fast, but if there are questions, please don't hesitate to ask those questions. I'm happy to go over something again, or just to clarify something again. So there's two types of reports that are being generated. There's aggregate reports and forensic reports. So going back to the previous tags here, so RUA is for your aggregate reports. RUF are for your forensic reports. So those are the two types of reports. So those are the reports that will be sent to you or sent to whomever you define in the policy by the recipient side. So the aggregate report will have all the information that you need in terms of IP address that's sending the message, whether DKIM SPF is passing or failing, whether the domain alignment is actually aligning or not aligning, and whether DMARC is passing or failing. It will give you all that information. It does not give you the details, so it does not say in the report where who the sender is and who the recipient is. It is not going to get that granular when it comes to the aggregate report. If it did, all you'll be doing all day is looking at reports, because especially if you send thousands of emails on a daily basis, all you'll be looking at reports, and it's just going to be too much and the reports size of the reports will be too large to deliver and to send. So that's why it only gives you IP addresses. If you have a translator, it'll translate the IP address to the domain and what's going on with DKIM, DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, and it's also for all authorized and unauthorized systems. So you're going to have to go through the report and make that determination to figure out, are these authorized or are they unauthorized? So that's where the analysis part of these reports is going to take some time, and it needs to get done in order to set up DMARC correctly and set up SPF and DKIM correctly. The forensic reports are going to be different, and you may not get many forensic reports, and I'll explain why. So for forensic reports, what it is that's the actual message that failed to be sent, or got rejected, or could have potentially been failed. That report, it's not really a report, it's the actual message, because you'll actually see who the sender is, who the recipient is. You'll see the actual message body, the message subject, and so on. So you can actually see the details of the message in the forensic side. So it's not really a report, because this is actually sending individual messages. So you get the individual message back. Problem is that there's a high privacy concern when it comes to forensic reports, because they don't know what report or message will come back to you, and that message could contain PII. It could contain sensitive information that you do not want a vendor or a third party or even someone on your IT staff to be able to read. So that's why forensic reports, a lot of organizations have decided that they don't want to send forensic reports back. Google has already made that decision. because they're saying that there's just too much of a chance of sending banking information or routing information and things like that. So we can't take that risk. I believe Microsoft is going to be following suit, and a lot of the consumer side, they're following suit as well when it comes to the RUF reports. So you may see that the RUF reports eventually start getting diminished. At this point, all I've been seeing for forensic on our end at GCA has mainly been out of office messages or calendar bounce backs. There was one case where we did see an invoice, and it, so we ended up telling, that's where we temporarily looked at, helped somebody review some of the reports, and we told them to disable RUF because of the risk of getting those types of messages. Now, the reports are sent in an email, obviously, and it's actually sent as an attachment in the email. So it's going to be a compressed file. And inside of those compressed files are XML documents. So it's everything that you're presented with in these reports, the aggregate reports, are XML. And they can be sent to multiple internal addresses. So you can send them to as many people as you like. I don't recommend that you send it to a personal work account. You should send up a generic account like DMARC@companyname.com or companyname.org. Send it to that, because then that way you don't get hammered with a large number of reports. You have one central location for all those reports, and you can review those reports. Because the number of reports does depend on the amount of email that you send out. So if you send out only like 10 to 20 messages a day, you probably get 1 or 2 reports back. It also depends on how many domains you send messages to. Because if those domains participate in DMARC verifications, good chance you'll get a report back. And the length of reports also depend on the amount of emails. So if you send like 1,000 emails in that day, then you're going to get one aggregate report that's going to contain all information about those thousand messages and consolidated. So you have to take that into account when you set this up. And last thing you want to do is hammer your own reports. So there was a question about asking Gmail or Hotmail to send you reports. Like I said, you can consider asking them, but they're not going to know what reports to send you, because it's not specific to the user account. It's just specific to their system, to their servers. So you're not going to be able to get them from Gmail, Hotmail. Now, if you're sending messages to Gmail or Hotmail users from your domain, you will get a report back from google.com, or you get a report back from microsoft.com. And you will get those reports back. In that situation, you can. Okay? But if you're a Gmail user and you want to see Gmail reports, that's not going to happen. You can only get reports for your domain. So if Google is a recipient, Hotmail's a recipient, Yahoo is a recipient, you will get a report back from them, and you'll get an aggregate report back from them. That will happen. And it is free to send back to you. They're not going to charge you for those reports. No one is charging for this whole report. The reports are free in themselves. Now, again, just to reiterate the importance of these reports at any level, whether you're at non, quarantine, or reject, the reports are going to give you all that information. It's going to tell you all the IP addresses of sending servers, and what's going on with DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. That's the only way you're going to know what changes need to be made to SPF and to DKIM. And the only way you'll know that when you're ready to move up to quarantine and to reject, the full actual enforcement of DMARC. So this way your IT staff or your email staff can correct whatever issues. They can add those third-party vendors that they weren't aware of, and add them to the SPF policy and set up a DKIM key for them. So in a sense, you're using these reports to create an IT asset inventory. Right? Now you'll know who are all your authorized mail servers or people who are sending on your behalf. This way you'll know if the marketing team is using something like SurveyMonkey, or your sales team is using Salesforce, or these third-party tools that they never told you about, to try to bypass your own mail systems because you're restricted the number of users that they can send it to. So this is how you'll know. But then at the same time, once you go to reject, now each of those teams have to go through the IT and email staff in order to be able to use those tools, because they can, if you're at quarantine or reject, if they go and sign up for a third-party email provider, they can send mail all they want. Those messages will not get through. Because if your policy is set to quarantine, all those messages will go to the spam folders. If you're set to reject, those messages will not even be delivered. Then they're going to wonder why, and the only people they're going to be able to ask are the IT staff, saying that, hey, we signed up for a third-party vendor, but no one's getting any of our messages. What's going on? Oh, well, we put a DMARC at reject, so you actually have to go through us, and you have control, and you have to give us the information in order to be able to approve this and add it to, and allow the DMARC policy to let those messages go through. So you have that level of control by implementing DMARC. And then hopefully everything that's left behind is all your spammers and your phishers and unauthorized systems. So hopefully I've answered most of the questions. If I haven't, then please feel free to post it if you don't feel I've answered the questions that have been posted there. Now, here's a sample aggregate report. This is an actual real report. This is ours at GCA. This is one of the reports when we were at quarantine so that we can go through and, again, just check to see what's going on. We took a leap and went straight to quarantine because we were actually not using any third-party providers or anything whatsoever. This is when we just started and started using email. But now we're at reject. But as you can see here, this is XML. I mean, some of it is human readable. You can understand some of the wording there. But if you look at it, this is only a snippet. There's more and more and more and more underneath this. So where eventually at some point you're going to get cross-eyed and you're going to lose track of where you are. So you are more than welcome to eyeball and go through this if you choose to. We do not recommend that you do that. So what are your options? So what can you do then if we're now recommending to eyeball it? So we're going to give you a few options. One is you can use DMARC service providers. So here's a list of different providers that we have partnered with that are providing services for DMARC. So what they will do is you can actually send them the DMARC reports, and they'll give you a nice web-based aggregate view of all of your reports. So whatever number of reports you get, they'll go to one of these vendors. You can log into their portal and take a look and see what's going on, what needs to be adjusted, what's failed, and things like that. Good question. Cost. I wish I could tell you what the cost is because each vendor is different, completely different in terms of their cost. So I don't personally know what their cost is. Some of the vendors, if you go to their site, they'll actually give you the cost. I know DMARCian, I believe on DMARC and DMARC Analyzer will actually give you their costs if you go to their website. That's because they provide an aggregate portal. They don't really do too much in terms of the consulting side. Now, whereas Agari, Valley Mail, Proofpoint, and Easy Solutions, you're going to have to talk to a sales rep to see what the costs are. And in most cases, they generally do it based on the amount of messages that are being sent out on a daily basis or a monthly basis. I forget how each one works. So there is going to be a cost associated with using one of these providers. But the benefit is that some of these vendors will actually help you. They'll help you with the DMARC implementation. They will get you up to reject as quickly as possible. And then you have that nice aggregate view of what's going on. Which one produces the best reports? I honestly can't say. I mean, I've used them all, and they're all very similar in terms of the actual view of the reports and the capabilities. Just really, you're going to have to go through to each vendor and see what things you might be looking for, because some of them provide additional capabilities that others don't. But it's really going to be dependent on what you really want from them and what you need. Because in terms of portal view and the view, they're very similar in what they're giving, but I can't really say which one is the best, to be honest, and that's being totally honest and not being biased in any way. But alternatively, there are free options available to you as well. So I mean, because we understand here at GCA that not everyone has the budget to add something like this and have someone do all the reporting and use a vendor to do this. So there are some free options that we can provide to you. So there are things like XML to human converters. So DMARCian, even though they have an aggregate portal view, they also decide, like, you know what, we want to give a free service with their XML uploader. It's actually called XML to human converter. But it's best if you have a small number of reports, because the way this works is that you upload each report that you have, and they give you an HTML view of each of those reports. So if you have 100 reports and you upload 100 reports, you can still get a review 100 reports. It's not going to give you one full aggregate review. You'll still have to go through each report individually. But the nice thing is is it gives you a nice web-based version of that report, so it's easier to read and easier to understand what's going on within that report. There are other DMARC analyzers like Postmark. Postmark actually provides a weekly service, so you can send them the reports on a daily basis, but they will only send you a full report on a weekly basis. There's DMARCanalyzer.com that they actually have provided limited free service capability, and it is very limited until you get, then you have to go to the cost aspect of it. MX Toolbox also provides a setup. I personally have never used the MX Toolbox, but based on our scans, our analysis of DMARC policies that are out there, MX Toolbox seems to be a very popular one as well. So we decided to put this up there. There's also another one called Netcraft. Netcraft seems to be a popular one as well. Then there's other third-party tools as well. So if you have an internal infrastructure, so if you're not using a cloud service provider, so you have your internal hardware and internal mail servers, you can use things like LinkedIn's, Lafayette, SendGrid's DMARC parser, or Yahoo's DMARC report parsers. So these organizations actually created their own DMARC reporting tools, and they basically, once they get the reports, you can feed them into these systems, and they give you a pretty decent view of those reports. They may not give you fully what you want, but at least gets you the starting point in terms of reviewing it. They're all available on GitHub, and there's many more that are out there as well. So if you go to dmarc.org to go to that website, there's a code and library section that's available on their site. They have more that are listed out on that site as well. And if you actually go out there and look at the UK government has actually released their own mail checker as well for DMARC. I believe it's called Mail Checker, and it's also available on GitHub as well. So those are some of the free options. But again, just take into account that some of these free options, you're going to need to spend time to do the analysis. So you actually have to do the analysis. You're going to have to go through those reports and do what you need to do and actually get to what's going on and where things are going. So does DMARC actually work? So I'm going to give you two success stories. One here is from Aetna, so a major health insurance provider. They implemented DMARC in 2015. So DMARC was released in 2012. They decided to implement it in 2015. And ever since they implemented, each year they're saying that approximately 60 million fraudulent messages are being prevented from being delivered to their partners and to consumers just by implementing DMARC. So this doesn't include the anti-phishing and anti-spamming tools, because I'm sure those are catching some other ones that DMARC isn't going to protect. But for their domain, Aetna.net, it's being prevented just by implementing DMARC, 60 million on a yearly basis. So one of the benefits of that, as well as they told us, was that the click-through rates on Aetna emails improved by 10% every year. Why? Because now their employees are only clicking on what they need to click on, and they're not wasting time trying to determine if a message is valid or not, because they have DMARC verification enabled for everything coming internally as well. So for all the incoming messages. So this is better. Now there's less calls to the customer support saying, okay, is this a valid mail or this is not a valid mail? So now customer support is actually working on things that they should be working on, rather than addressing spam or phishing type email messages. So this is just showing that this trust component is being added to this. Then HMRC, so this is UK government's Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So basically their tax department in essence. They implemented DMARC, and it did take them time to implement DMARC. I believe they said it took them either 2 or 3 years, and the reason is because they tried to do it on their own initially, and because of the amount of reports they were getting and the messages they send on a daily basis, they had to get another vendor. They had to get a vendor to help them out. But once they finally implemented it, and at the highest level of reject, in 1 year they stopped 300 million phishing emails that were using their email addresses. 300 million. That's a lot. And I wouldn't even think that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs would be actually sending out 300 million messages. So that means that there's other unauthorized sources that were using their name and trying to steal information during tax season. So that's so this was something that was big on their part and helped them greatly in terms of implementation. So now we talked about all the benefits, but we also want to make sure that people understand that there going to be concerns that people have questions about and have brought to us in terms of the actual implementation. So I want to go through some of those concerns and hopefully alleviate some of those concerns. So one concern is that, and one thing to note, that DMARC is not a silver bullet. It's not going to prevent all and everything in terms of phishing. You still need your anti-spam and anti-phishing tools. They need to be present. So it doesn't mean that you implement DMARC and get rid of those tools. No, you still need those because those are going to protect you for other things. DMARC is only protecting your organization's domain name. So globalcyberalliance.org is the only domain that's actually being protected. So that means that globalcyberalliance.com, globalcyberalliance.net, they're not being protected. The only way that we here at GCA could protect those domain names is to purchase those domains and then apply a DMARC policy on those domains. Even though we're not using them for email purposes, we took those domains, we got those variations and said, okay, let's put in a DMARC policy of reject. So that way, though, no one can ever use those domains, even us, until we change our policy or change our settings. Also take into account the ones that so if I could say Microsoft.com, if somebody was using a 1 instead of an I or a 0 instead of an O, DMARC is not going to protect it. It's going to protect exactly the domain that you're specifying the policy for. And you have to own those domains in order to protect it. Because if you don't own those domains, you can't just willy-nilly create a policy for that domain. Otherwise, at that point, people can just do whatever they wanted to do. Could email break? Yeah, there's a chance of email breaking, but that typically happens when implementation is not done correctly. So some people have jumped directly to reject, and they weren't aware of the third-party vendors that need to be added. So that broke email because the other teams couldn't send messages at that point. They could only use their own mail servers. Could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you see it. You also have to make sure syntax is correct, because it's like coding. If you don't have the underscore DMARC for the name, and you just start with DMARC, that's a problem, because no one knows. They're looking for underscore DMARC, not just DMARC dot. Make sure your syntax, make sure you have the semicolons in the right place. Make sure your spacing is correct. Make sure your spelling is correct. Those kinds of things need to be done, and that's why we always recommend start at level none and then work your way up to reject. Other one is not enough resources. So this can be a concern because depending on how large your organization is and how many subdomains you have, the implementation could be time consuming because you're going to have to go through each of those subdomains and see, are they actually using messages or third-party tools and things like that to send mail? Is there something that you have to look at differently? But what we've seen is a lot more is that it's easy for people to get to none, which it is. It's easy to implement a DMARC policy of none. It's hard to get to quarantine or reject because you need resources to review those reports. So those report analysis, and you need to take time to do that. So either use the DMARC vendor, especially if you get a lot of reports on a daily basis. How do you know? Put up DMARC policy of none. Receive some of the reports. You'll know how many reports you get. So you can determine whether you need to use a vendor or maybe one of the free options can work for you instead. And the other aspect is that mailing lists and mail forwarders. SPF, DKIM, and DMARC don't play well with mailing lists and mail forwarders. Because what you're doing with mailing lists is when you send a mail there, that mailing list servers are now sending out the message. Not your servers are no longer you being the ones that actually send that out. But there is a solution to this. And it's something that came out in just recently, I believe it was 2016, late 2016, which is called Authenticated Receive Chain, or ARC. Not to be confused with the ARC and DMARC, because it is two separate things. What Authenticated Receive Chain will do is it'll protect SPF, DKIM, and DMARC from the original messages and allow those messages to get forward without breaking that chain. So if you're interested, or if you're new people who have mailing lists and mail forwarders, please talk to them and point them to arc-spec.org to get more information. But hopefully what I talked about in that last slide is, and is not no longer a concern, because there are some things you can do and ways around those concerns. But the benefits of DMARC far outweigh those concerns and should far outweigh those concerns. And we have our return on investment of DMARC that Agari provided. If you want to look at the full report, just go to agari.com/ROI. Here's some numbers that they tell you in terms of how much, in terms of cost savings, how much money is being saved by implementing DMARC. So what can you do next? So the next thing should be is to go in and get started with DMARC. Go in and implement DMARC at policy level none and see what's going on with your domain. See who's using it and see what's going on, and then work your way up to quarantine and reject. It's easy to start out and implement at none because nothing is going to happen to messages. There's no risk involved with having a DMARC policy set at none, unless you consider a risk being getting a number of reports. So we have a DMARC setup guide. You can go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org for more information, and you can also go through there to get to the DMARC guide. And the DMARC guide will actually check to see if you have SPF, DKIM, or DMARC in place. And then you can actually use each of those components and go through a nice little guide to help you set up set up and create what the DMARC record would look like at the when you go through it. So that way you have a better understanding of each of those components and each of the tags that are associated with it. We also have a 90 days to DMARC challenge that is currently in progress, so it's not too late to join it. We're following the U.S. federal government and their 90-day challenge in terms of having the federal government agencies implement DMARC at least to policy level none, and then they have a year after that to implement it at reject. But we wanted to go ahead and do this as well and make this challenge out to everyone. So you're more than welcome to join us on this. Again, if you go to dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org, there's a banner there where you can go and register and see all the webinars and resources that are associated with the 90-day challenge. Otherwise, there are additional resources available to you. So the dmarc.org is a great site because those are the founders, those are the creators of DMARC. They put all their information there. I've already mentioned the GCA website. The webinar is also available on the site. You can also go to our YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel has multiple number of videos in terms of DMARC. So we have executive level videos, we have how DMARC works, we have the webinar up there. This is being recorded, so we'll send you the recording afterwards as well. There's videos on the DMARC setup guide. There's also videos on how to actually go through the process of implementing SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and actually showing you how to put it into a DNS record for Office 365 and Google G Suites. So you're more than welcome. It's free. We're not charging for a subscription or anything on the YouTube. Everything that GCA does, we have that, and we're sending that to do for free. We just don't do DMARC aggregate reporting backend. We don't compete with the DMARC vendors in any way like that. We just help with guidance and education and awareness when it comes to DMARC. So I know we went over 3 minutes over. I thank you for your time. I am going to stay on, in case there are any additional questions, because I have one question that I am going to do my best to answer. But thank you for attending. Feel free to email me at any point in time. You have 2 email addresses there. Both of them will come to me. The GCA-DMARC will go to additional people as well, so you're more than welcome to use that in case I don't respond back right away. But you are welcome to email me to help with any assistance or guidance in getting started. We'll get you where we can get you as far as we can. But again, like I said, we don't provide the level of services some of the DMARC vendors do. So we don't provide like high-level consulting. We don't provide report reviews or aggregate report backend servers. So we don't take reports and consume reports or anything like that. So there is a question about RUF reports. Is there a way to encourage MTAs as Hotmail, Gmail to send back RUF? Do you know if main MTAs have communication channels to answer questions regarding DMARC, RUA, and RUF reports? So in this sense, when it comes to RUF reports, again, the main reason they are not doing it, because I believe they initially did do RUF, but the main reason they're not doing it is because of the privacy issues. And there's a high level of privacy concern. So that's why they've decided to move away from those. Because I mean, there is a risk that there's going to be things like invoices. There is going to be a chance that there is going to be a company's banking information or your routing information. That kind of stuff, if you send that in an email, it's a good chance that RUF will contain exactly that information. So if someone were to intercept that, or if you had a compromise on your mail server, on your messages, you now potentially can have theft of PII, and that information can be stolen. That's why they're moving away from the RUFs. And that's why all of them are actually sending RUA reports. That is not being discontinued. So Google's and Yahoo's and all the major consumers, mail providers are sending RUA reports. For that aspect of it. And in terms of making an agreement with the MTAs for RUF delivery, I'm not aware of any, because from my understanding is when it comes to these reports, it's either all or none. I don't believe that they can set it up in terms of specific domains. I mean, you could always try contacting Google or Microsoft to see if they'd be willing to do something like that, but I highly doubt they will, because from discussions that I've heard, and groups back channels that I've heard, that they've made a decision that RUF just if there's just too much of a privacy concern and goes against a lot of organizations' privacy policies. So they just don't no longer want to take that risk. So at that point, that is the only question. But if there are any other questions, I'm happy to stay on. If you don't or you can't think of a question right now, feel free to send me an email at smirs@globalcyberalliance.org, and we will answer those questions for you as needed. Again, thank you for joining our webinar.